What if the story we call the Great Flood was not the beginning of destruction, but the last moment we remembered? What if long before that flood, there were other endings, quiet ones, forgotten ones, so complete that no ruins were left behind? Not erased by fire, not shattered by war, but gently covered, layer by layer, until even memory itself grew uncertain. Tonight we are not asking what destroyed the ancient world. We are asking something far more unsettling. What if humanity has already survived more endings than we can remember? And the Great Flood was simply the last story that remained, before stories learned to speak in the sharp edges of names and dates. Before memory hardened into myth, there was a softer way of remembering. Not as a warning carved into stone, not as a command passed from voice to voice, but as a feeling carried quietly through generations, a sense that the world had once been different, and that it had changed not once but many times, each change leaving behind a faint residue, like a tide line on a wall long after the water has withdrawn. In the deepest hours of the night, when thought slows and the mind drifts without resistance, it becomes easier to imagine this kind of memory, not a memory of an individual life, but of a lineage, a long awareness stretching backward through countless uncounted lives, each one inheriting fragments of understanding without knowing their origin. An instinctive caution toward the sea, a reverence for high ground, a quiet respect for cycles that arrive without warning and depart without explanation. There is something in human storytelling that has always leaned toward endings. Not sudden endings, but slow dissolves. Landscapes that change their shape while people continue to walk upon them, unaware that the ground beneath their feet once lay far above water, or far below it. In this way, the past does not disappear. It settles. It becomes part of the background hum of existence, barely audible, yet always present. Only after we sit with this stillness for a while, does the old question begin to surface gently without urgency. What if the Great Flood, so often remembered as the beginning of everything that followed, was not the first great ending humanity endured? What if it was only the most recent memory that survived intact enough to be told? What if earlier collapses passed so quietly, or so completely, that they left behind no names at all, only instincts and half-remembered fears? To consider this possibility is not to imagine a single lost world, but many. Not one great cataclysm, but a rhythm. Advances, followed by pauses. Growth followed by retreat. Long periods of stability interrupted by moments when the environment itself should adapt or dissolve. In such a world, survival would not belong to the strongest or the most advanced, but to those who learned how to let go, how to move, how to forget just enough to begin again. If floods were part of this rhythm, they may not always have arrived as overwhelming disasters. Some may have come slowly, water creeping inland year by year, swallowing fields and paths, turning familiar routes into shallow channels, before anyone realized the change was permanent. Others may have followed colder endings, when ice withdrew and seas reclaimed what had once been land. In these moments, collapse would not have felt like destruction, but like displacement, a quiet unmaking of place rather than of people. Those who lived through such changes would not necessarily have seen themselves as survivors of a catastrophe. They would simply have adapted. They would have moved inland, or uphill, or toward new sources of food. They would have carried with them the knowledge that the world does not stay fixed, that stability is temporary, that what seems eternal can soften and shift without warning. Over time, this understanding would become tradition, then story, then myth. Perhaps this is why flood narratives appear so often in human memory across cultures that never met. Not because they all experienced the same single event, but because water has always been one of the quiet agents of change. It erases boundaries without noise. It reshapes landscape without intent. It leaves behind no ruins in the way fire or war does, only altered shorelines and drowned valleys that with time become invisible again. If humanity had already endured multiple collapses before the flood that later traditions would elevate into a defining moment, then the Great Flood itself may have been remembered not because it was unique, but because it arrived at a time when memory was finally ready to hold on, when stories could travel farther than a single valley, when symbols could preserve meaning across generations. Earlier endings may have been just as profound, but they passed through societies that lacked the means to record them in durable ways. Their knowledge would have been carried in behavior rather than words, in where people chose to settle, in how they built their dwellings, in which places they avoided without knowing why. These are the kinds of memories that do not announce themselves. They whisper. In imagining a world shaped by repeated collapse, it becomes easier to understand why ancient traditions often speak of cycles. Time in these stories does not march forward toward a destination. It turns, it returns, it folds back on itself. Each age inherits fragments of the last, reshaped by loss and survival. In such a way, endings are not failures, they are transitions. What might a society look like if it had already learned this lesson long before recorded history began? It would not build monuments meant to last forever. It would favor materials that could be abandoned without regret. It would value portability of knowledge over permanence of structure. Teaching would matter more than architecture. Memory would live in people rather than stone. Such societies may have existed and vanished many times, not wiped out, but absorbed, their descendants blending into new populations, carrying forward subtle tendencies without names attached. Over thousands of years, the original context would fade, leaving behind only symbolic remnants. A warning about the seed air, a sense that the world had once been fuller, richer, more populated, before something unnamed changed it. When later cultures look back and tried to make sense of these inherited fragments, they may have compressed many endings into one. The Great Flood, in this light, becomes less a single historical event, and more a container for memory, a narrative vessel holding echoes of numerous collapses, each layered atop the other until they could no longer be distinguished. This would explain the strange calm that often accompanies ancient flood stories. They are not always told with terror, as if the flood was expected, as if it was part of an order already understood. Survival, in these accounts, is rarely heroic. It is practical. Build, move, preserve what you cannot. If this is so, then humanity's deepest inheritance may not be technological knowledge, a familiarity with impermanence, a quiet understanding that civilizations are temporary arrangements within a much older, slower-moving world. This kind of wisdom does not shout. It settles into culture, slowly shaping values over generations. Even today, traces of this awareness remain in the way humans feel drawn to beginnings and endings. In the comfort some find in cyclical explanations, in the recurring intuition that progress alone cannot protect against change. These feelings do not come from books. They rise from somewhere deeper, older than conscious memory. If the Great Flood was not the first collapse humanity survived, then it was not the first time people stood at the edge of a changing world, uncertain whether what lay ahead would resemble what they were leaving behind. It was simply one moment in a long sequence of departures. One chapter that happened to be remembered clearly enough to endure, and perhaps that is the quiet lesson carried forward through sleep and story alike, that humanity has always been resilient, not because it conquers the world, but because it learns how to endure its transformations. That loss is not an interruption of history, but one of its primary forces, and that beneath every remembered ending lies a deeper forgotten one, waiting silently beneath the surface, like land beneath the sea, unchanged, patient, and unseen. Long before anyone thought to name the flood, long before it was framed as a singular turning point, there may have been an older familiarity with endings themselves, as a gradual loosening of the bonds that hold the world together, until it quietly becomes something else. In such a reality, collapse would not arrive with trumpets or terror. It would arrive as absence, as the slow disappearance of familiar paths, familiar season, familiar certainties. Imagine a shoreline that retreats a little each year. It's not enough to alarm anyone at first. Fishermen still cast their nets. Children still play where their parents once did. But landmarks begin to vanish. A stone used for generations as a meeting place now sits closer to the water. A grove that once stood dry becomes marsh. The change is subtle enough that no single person witnesses its beginning or its end. Only the collective memory carries the sense that something has been lost. If humanity endured many such transitions, then its relationship with the world would be shaped not by confidence, but by attentiveness. They would watch the behavior of animals, the movement of clouds, the shifting taste of water. Knowledge would be observational, not abstract, passed on through stories that did not explain, but suggested. These stories may not have been told as warnings. They may have been told as woven into daily life, tales of waters that came before, not to frighten but to orient, to teach when to move, when to wait, when to let go. In this way, memory would remain alive without overwhelming those who carried it. As generations passed, the specifics would blur, the names of places would fade, the sequence of events would soften, but the emotional shape of the experience would remain intact. A sense that the world is capable of quiet erasure, that safety is provisional, that survival depends not on resistance but on timing. When later societies reached a point where they could finally record their stories in more permanent forms, they gathered the fragments and shaped them into a single narrative strong enough to endure. The Great Flood becomes, in this sense, a memory scaffold, a way of holding together truths that were otherwise too diffuse to preserve. This does not diminish the power of the flood story. It deepens it. It transforms it from a report into a reflection. The flood becomes a symbol not of punishment or failure, but of continuity through change, a reminder that humanity has been here before, in different forms, under different skies, learning the same lesson again and again. If earlier collapses left fewer traces, it may be because those who lived through them did not attempt to preserve everything. They may have understood intuitively that clinging too tightly to the old world could hinder adaptation to the new one. Instead of rebuilding what was lost, they carried forward what mattered most. Relations, sifways. This kind of inheritance does not fossilize easily. It leaves no grand ruins, no unmistakable signatures for later ages to uncover. Its evidence lies in patterns of settlement, in recurrent motifs that arise independently, yet feel strangely aligned. These are the traces of survival that do not announce themselves as history. Perhaps this is why modern attempts to trace a single origin for flood traditions always feel incomplete. The stories resist being pinned down to one place, one time, one cause. They behave more like echoes than records, each retelling slightly altered, yet unmistakably related, like waves overlapping on the surface of the sea. In a world shaped by repeated endings, progress would not be imagined as a straight ascent. It would be understood as a series of recoveries, each recovery building upon the last, yet always vulnerable to the same forces that shape those before it. This perspective would incapacity can dissolve as easily as it forms. Such humility may once have been widespread. It may have guided decisions about where to build, how much to accumulate, how deeply to entangle identity with place. Over time, as stability returned and memory faded, that humility may have softened into confidence, and with confidence, that the world had settled into a final shape. The Great Flood, remembered and retold, may have been the last moment when that assumption was publicly challenged, when the old awareness briefly resurfaced and demanded acknowledgement. Afterward, as rebuilding began, the lesson may once again have retreated into the background, preserved only in story, yet even when forgotten. Such lessons do not vanish completely. They resurface in moments of uncertainty, in the quiet unease that accompanies environmental change, in the recurring sense that history has deeper layers than we can easily access. These feelings do not require explanation. If humanity has survived many collapses, then survival itself becomes less remarkable than continuity of consciousness. The ability to recognize patterns across time, to feel the shape of an ending before it fully arrives, to sense when a world is loosening, even if its structures still stand. This awareness may have guided migrations long before maps existed. It may have shaped myths that emphasize renewal over dominance. It may explain why some ancient traditions speak not of conquering nature, but of aligning with it, of listening rather than commanding. In such traditions, water is rarely an enemy. It is a messenger, a boundary that shifts according to rules older than human intention. Floods are not framed as mistakes, but as movements within a larger system. To survive them is not to defeat them, but to step aside at the right moment. If earlier collapses taught this lesson repeatedly, then the Great Flood may have been remembered because it arrived at a threshold between worlds. Between an age where knowledge lived mostly in bodies and habits, and an age where it could finally be externalized into symbols. Writing did not create memory, but it fixed one version of it in place. Everything before that fixation becomes harder to see, not because it did not exist, but because it did not need to be preserved in the same way. Its knowledge was already alive, circulating through communities, in behaviors. Once that living memory weakened, only fragments remained. To imagine humanity as an enduring presence across many endings is to shift the focus away from loss and toward adaptation. Not adaptation as a technical process, but as a psychological one. The willingness to accept impermanence without despair, to rebuild without insisting that the new world mirror the old. It suggests that uncertainty is not a failure of understanding, but a natural state. That the feeling of standing at the edge of something unknown has been experienced countless times before. And each time humanity found a way to continue, changed but not erased. As the night deepens and thought slows further, this idea settles gently into the mind. The sense that beneath every remembered beginning lies an older ending. That history is not a line, but a tide. Advancing, retreating, reshaping the shore, leaving behind traces that only reveal themselves when the light is low and the mind is still. And in that stillness, the Great Flood no longer feels like an origin. It feels like a moment of recognition. A pause in the long movement of time, where humanity briefly looked back, sensed the depth of what had already passed, and chose to remember it as best it could, as memory settled into story, and story into tradition. The earlier collapses receded even further into silence. They became less like events, and more like impressions, shaping thought without demanding attention. Humanity moved forward carrying a quiet familiarity with loss, even as each new generation believed itself to be standing at the beginning of something unprecedented. This may be why so many ancient narratives speak not of triumph, but of restraint, of boundaries respected because they were felt to be fragile. The world, in these stories, is never entirely conquered. It is borrowed, held for a time, then altered in ways no one can fully prevent. If earlier worlds ended softly, then their endings would not have announced themselves as disasters. Winters that lingered, summers that shortened, rivers that forgot their old paths. These changes would not have inspired panic, but adjustment. A recalibration of daily life rather than an abandonment of it. Over long stretches of time, such adjustments accumulate. Villages move, and eventually, the memory of why these changes began dissolves, leaving only the changes themselves. This is how collapse can become invisible, not because it did not matter, but because it was absorbed too thoroughly to stand apart. When the Great Flood entered human memory in a more defined way, it may have done so precisely because it disrupted this pattern. Perhaps it arrived faster, or perhaps it coincided with a moment when societies had grown less accustomed to adaptation, when stability had lasted long enough to feel permanent. In such a context, even a familiar force would feel shocking. Yet even then, the response preserved in story is rarely one of outrage. It is one of obedience. Build the vessel, gather what can be saved, accept what cannot. This tone suggests recognition rather than surprise. As if the flood was terrible, but not incomprehensible. As if it belonged to a known category of endings. If that is so, then the Great Flood story does not stand alone. It stands atop a foundation of earlier experiences, now unreachable, except through inference. It is the visible peak of a much larger submerged structure, one that supports it silently. To imagine humanity in this way is to imagine continuity, not of form, but of awareness. The shapes of societies may change completely. The underlying relationship between humans and an unpredictable world remains remarkable. It thrives in repetition, in the steady passing of habits from parent to child, in the unspoken understanding of which places feel safe and which feel temporary. These are lessons that do not fade easily, even when their origins are forgotten. As time moved on and writing became more common, to store it outside the body, this brought new possibilities. But also nouveaux memories. Written memory can persist beyond the conditions that gave rise to it. It can be misunderstood, reinterpreted, stripped of context. Living memory, by contrast, the Great Flood, preserved in text and tradition, may therefore represent a turning point not only in environmental history, but in memory itself. A moment when experience was fixed into narrative, gaining durability at the cost of flexibility. Everything before that moment becomes harder to recover, not because it was less important, but because it was never meant to be frozen in place. Earlier collapses may have been processed through living systems of knowledge that left no clear boundary between before and after. The world changed, and people changed with it. Only movement. Seen through this lens, the idea of a single first collapse becomes less compelling. It reflects a later desire for origins rather than an earlier reality of cycles. Humanity may not have asked in its earliest phases. When everything began, it may only have asked how to continue. How to continue without knowing what comes next. How to build without assuming permanence. How to remember without clinging too tightly to the past. These are not questions with definitive answers. They are practices refined through repetition. If the Great Flood was not the first collapse humanity survived, then survival itself becomes less about exception. Humanity persists not by escaping change, but by moving within it. By allowing worlds to end, without allowing consciousness to vanish with them. In the quiet space before sleep, this understanding carries a certain calm. It reframes loss as something endured many times before. It suggests that uncertainty is not a modern condition, but an ancient one. That the feeling of standing on unstable ground is deeply familiar, even if we cannot explain why. Perhaps this is the final inheritance of those forgotten worlds, not technologies or monuments, but a psychological resilience. So deeply embedded that it feels instinctive, a capacity to live with impermanence, to sense that endings. In this sense, the Great Flood is not a warning of annihilation, but a reminder of continuity. A story that survived because it spoke to something already known. Something carried quietly through countless lives, across landscapes that changed their shape again and again. And so when we listen to these ancient echoes, we are not hearing the voice of a single moment. We are hearing the accumulated memory of many endings layered into one gentle narrative. A way of saying without urgency or fear that humanity has been here before, that the world has shifted many times, and that each time, life found a way to continue, altered, quieter but still aware. In the deepest layers of rest, where thought no longer insists on clarity, this feeling begins to settle more fully. The sense that none of this is new, that humanity has stood at the edge of uncertainty before, not once, but many times, each encounter leaving behind a faint imprint in the shared mind of the species. In those moments long ago, people may not have spoken of collapse at all. There may have been no word for it. What they experienced was simply change that could not be resisted. The slow realization that the world they knew was becoming less recognizable, less predictable, less aligned with memory. And so they adjusted. Not dramatically, but carefully, step by step, until one day they found themselves living in a different world, without ever marking the moment it arrived. This is how the deepest transformations often occur, not with declarations, but with quiet acceptance. A path no longer used, a coastline remembered only in stories told to children who have never seen it themselves. Over time, the story remains, but the place dissolves. If humanity endured many such transitions, then the instinct to narrate endings softly makes sense. Loud endings demand attention. Soft endings require endurance only through repetition. Each time the world reshaped itself, humanity may have learned a little more about how to remain human within unfamiliar conditions. In this way, survival was not a singular achievement, but an ongoing practice. One that favored flexibility over strength, awareness over certainty. The most enduring knowledge would not have been how to build higher walls, but how to recognize when walls no longer mattered. The Great Flood, remembered as a defining boundary, may therefore represent the moment when this practice finally acquired a shape that could be passed down intact. A story sturdy enough to survive long after the conditions that created it had vanished. Yet even then, it carried the tone of something already known, as if those who told it understood that it was not describing the first time the world had slipped out of alignment with human expectation. Earlier collapses may have taught that resistance was less useful than timing, that those who moved early suffered less than those who waited for certainty, that certainty itself was often the last illusion to dissolve. These lessons, absorbed over countless lives, would become intuition, a quiet sensitivity to change. This may explain why humanity has always been drawn to stories of cycles, of ages rising and falling, of worlds ending not in finality but in transformation. These stories do not promise safety, they promise continuity, the assurance that life persists even when familiar structures do not. In such a woe, the question is never whether the world will change, but how one should live while it does. How lightly to hold what exists, how carefully to pass on what cannot be replaced, how to accept that some things must be allowed to disappear so that others may take their place. When listened to in this way, the Great Flood becomes less a warning and more a reflection, a mirror held up to humanity's long experience with impermanence. It does not demand fear, it invites remembrance, not of a single event, but of a pattern repeated so many times, as night deepens and awareness softens. This understanding does not arrive as a conclusion, it arrives as reassurance. The reassurance that uncertainty has always been part of the human condition, that standing at the threshold of change is not a sign of failure, but of participation in a much older rhythm. If humanity has survived many collapses, then survival is not the exception. It is the rule. What changes is not the fact of continuation, but the form it takes. Language alter, landscapes rearrange themselves, stories condense, yet something essential continues to move forward, carrying with it a memory of having endured before. And so the Great Flood, rather than marking the beginning of history, may simply mark the moment when humanity paused long enough to remember out loud, to give shape to an understanding that had already been lived many times, to acknowledge gently and without urgency that the world had ended before, and that life had gone on. In this quiet recognition, there is no drama, only presence. The awareness that beneath the surface of every stable moment lies a history of change, and that beneath every remembered ending lies another, older one, softened by time, waiting patiently in the depths of human memory.